Viewers, world leaders have gathered in French city Evian for the G7 huddle. India is not a G7 member, but in today's geopolitical landscape, India being made part of such conversations has become a global necessity. This is the 7th consecutive G7 summit that Prime Minister Modi is attending. Prime Minister Modi held key bilateral meetings with several world leaders on the sidelines yesterday, and today the spotlight shifts to the bilateral between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump. Now, both leaders greeted each other yesterday. It was the first time both came face to face after 16 months. Last time these two leaders met face to face was in February 2025 at the White House in Washington, D.C., shortly after Trump's inauguration. Then the relations nosedived due to a number of issues, and that's why the enhanced focus on the bilateral. Can this meeting really reset the strained ties is the question. There is hope, but then there are dark clouds too. First up, when both met each other yesterday, they did not share a hug. There was just a handshake. Now, this despite the mutual praise on social media over the last few months. The biggest issue is killing of 3 Indian sailors after US attacks on commercial ships in Omani waters just a week ago. Prime Minister Narendra Modi yesterday spoke about this issue during an address to G7 leaders, which included US President Donald Trump as well. And here's what the Prime Minister had said. He said several Indian civilians lost their lives. Safety of seafarers is our responsibility. He said that seafarers connect nations via maritime trade, and that's the reason why the world must ensure sea routes remain secure. Seafarers should be able to work without any kind of fear. So in front of Donald Trump, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made these points yesterday. Now, global political analyst Jan Bremer spoke exclusively to Times Now's managing editor Zaka Jacob ahead of this key meeting, and he said there should be an apology from the US. Listen in.
Prime Minister Modi and President Trump meeting in the afternoon here in Evian. It's the first time both men will be meeting since February of 2025. A lot has transpired on the trade issue, the tariffs issue, the Russian oil issue. But the most pressing and the most immediate one is the shooting and killing of 3 Indian sailors by American Navy fire. How do you think these issues will be brought up in this meeting?
Well, there should be an apology. Obviously, my understanding is this was in Omani territorial waters. There's really no excuse for that, and I understand that neither the United States nor India wants a big fight over this. But, you know, much the same as when India and Canada had a very significant flap over a Canadian citizen that Canada said had been killed by the Indians. They expected an apology. They wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. I expect India expects an apology here. They want to make sure it doesn't happen again. These were Indian citizens that were minding their own business, and they were killed by the United States in a mistake. Obviously, they weren't intentionally targeted by the Americans, but nonetheless, it's a problem. I do think that both leaders want this relationship to maintain a level of stability. I think India has been disappointed that a lot of the leaning into the Quad and leaning into the U.S. relationship strategically, militarily, technologically has not panned out as well as they would have liked, certainly not given the tariffs that came after Liberation Day. And I think India is hedging to a greater degree as a consequence. So I think the meeting will go well, but I'd be surprised if the headlines reflect a breakthrough of any sort.
And joining us right now is Rakesh Sood, former Indian diplomat. He has served as ambassador to Nepal, Afghanistan and France, and has also served as special envoy of the Prime Minister for nuclear non-proliferation. Sir, thank you very much for speaking with us here on Times Now. Ahead of this meeting that's going to take place between US President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Modi spoke about trust deficit in the world and the need to rebuild it. Now, this statement is being interpreted in several ways as he was sitting next to Donald Trump when he said this. What is your interpretation?
Sorry, could you repeat? I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now, sir? Am I audible?
It's very faint.
Is it better now?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. Sir, I was trying to understand from you the statement that Prime Minister Narendra Modi made yesterday about trust deficit in the world and the need to rebuild it. He said this, when he was sitting next to Donald Trump, and it is being interpreted in several ways given the kind of relations that are there between US and India. What is your interpretation of what the Prime Minister has said?
Well, we know that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump are meeting after a year and a half. They had some opportunities to meet each other during this time, but they didn't, even though contacts at other levels of Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense continued. But we also know that President Trump has taken certain steps during the last 18 months, the tariffs on India, the penalty tariffs on India on purchase of Russian oil, the frequent assertions that he brought the India-Pakistan conflict to an end. He called India a dead economy, not far back. He has just today, I don't know if your viewers know this, that in 2018, the U.S. Pacific Command in Hawaii had been renamed as Indo-Pacific Command. Quad was given a great amount of importance that was continued by President Biden. And just today, the name has been reverted back to PACOM, Pacific Command. So in a sense, if we take all this together, it is clear that India does not appear to have the same kind of position in U.S. thinking, in U.S. strategic thinking, as perhaps it did in the past.
Okay.
And so obviously that is something that India will have to come to terms with. But I think even America's closest allies are finding it difficult to figure out how to decipher President Trump's pronouncements, including NATO allies. And perhaps today the most disappointed would be Prime Minister Netanyahu.
You're right. And in fact, I was going to come to that name change as well that has taken place. Do you really see any intention to mend ties or make, the relationship better from the American side? Now, I'm asking this because of two reasons. One reason you've already cited, the name change that has happened. We've gone back to the name that used to exist before 2018. Another important aspect is Secretary of State Marco Rubio did not even express remorse in the death of 3 Indian sailors. And now the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command being renamed as U.S. Pacific Command just hours before this meeting.
Well, it just means that perhaps the U.S. has had a rethink on its role in the Pacific. This is something that India will have to discuss, because if you combine this with the fact that a Quad summit hasn't taken place, and there is no likelihood, it didn't take place last year, and President Trump is unlikely to visit. Now, if Indo-Pacific no longer exists and it is just the Pacific Command, then does Quad have the same salience as it once did, or we thought it did? So perhaps we have to recalibrate our own approach to some of these things. Then we also saw President Trump's recent visit to China, which was an enormously successful visit. There is talk about 3 more meetings with President Xi Jinping during the course of this year. One during the G20, which is going to take place in the US. One during the APEC summit, which is going to take place in China. And plus, President Xi Jinping is expected to make a bilateral visit to the United States in the month of September. So 3 more bilateral visits during the course of this year. I think the kind of strategic vision that has guided India-US relations since the turn of the century is certainly reflecting a shift of perspectives.
Are we looking at G2? I'm asking you this at a time when we have the focus on G7 in France, G2, China and US together?
Well, G2 is perhaps being too presumptuous at this stage. It was talked about even in 2009, 2010, but nothing much came out of it. But then today we have a different China. and we have a different US. So, I mean, as we know, in politics, in global politics, truth is always stranger than reality and never fails to surprise us. But at this stage, I would just say that I think there is a basic shift in the approach to China that President Trump took during his first term and the approach that he is taking in Trump 2.0. Because at that time, if you remember, Defense Secretary was General Jim Mattis. He made a big announcement when he announced the name change. And he talked of the growing importance of Indian Ocean. And it was widely interpreted as a growing US interest in India's role in the overall Indo-Pacific region. Today, does this role continue? Does it not continue? And then the activation at a higher level of Quad was also seen as a corresponding signal. Now, we've seen that on both these initiatives, there has been backpedaling, as it were, or both of these seem to be on the back burner.
Right.
So I'm sure we will have our own partnerships in the Pacific that we will make, which we have been trying to do.
Okay.
And I think we saw signs of that in January when we had the India-EU summit, and we saw signs of it just 2 days back when we saw the bilateral with President Macron.
Interesting. Now, sir, the expectation is also there that Trump should apologize for the death of Indian sailors, given how he always talks about how much he loved this country and the Prime Minister. Do you have any such expectations?
Frankly, I don't, because if, as you reminded us, if Secretary Rubio's conversation with External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar is any indication, I doubt if there are going to be apologies. If at all, there may be regrets for all innocent people having lost their lives, and that would cover everybody, including the Indian seafarers.
Okay. What, in your opinion, has been the biggest setback for ties since their last meeting in February?
Well, one is, I think there is a different set of people, a different set of advisors, different set of cabinet officials, secretaries that are there in Trump 2.0. And perhaps they have a different perspective. The second is, of course, President Trump's own inclinations, as it were. Perhaps there were people at that time who could sort of curb some of these inclinations. This time, perhaps you don't have that. That is why we've seen two, I would say, misadventures with Iran. We saw one last year, last June, and we've seen one now. And the whole world has talked about it. And we don't know. We've seen now the 14-point MOU that has been that is going to be signed officially day after tomorrow, which has been initialed. It doesn't seem to indicate, and that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be most unhappy at having been left out, considering that he had been the prime mover. He thought this was a great achievement to get the president to back him and to get the US forces to fight together, something which no US president has ever done since Carter, since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And yet the outcome of that is something which is now weighing heavy on Prime Minister Netanyahu's own political career.
One last question, sir, before we let you go. You understand diplomacy very well. Realistically, what are you expecting from this Modi-Trump meeting this evening at 6:15?
I think it is very difficult to predict because what President Trump is going to say. But I think I would be satisfied if there are some positive vibes. We didn't see the two. I mean, Prime Minister Modi is known for his diplomatic hugs, but this time we didn't see him exchanging hugs with President Trump. That to me seems to be a fairly important signal. The two just shook hands. So I think perhaps even Prime Minister Modi is a little wary of not being seen in terms of the eyes of the Indian public.
Right.
Because I think there is a feeling in India of having been let down by the US, and which is perhaps why Prime Minister Modi did not get around to hugging him. So I
Right.
suppose there is that little downturn. The question is, you need to put a floor under that downturn very quickly, because after all, it is an important relationship.
Right.
So whether we can get positive signs on the trade agreement,
Okay.
whether we can get other positive signals on some of the other multiple areas of
Right.
cooperation that we have with India and US, I think because we've seen even the H-1B visa judgment has gone against President Trump.
True. True.
You know, he doesn't like things going against him. He doesn't like his decisions being overturned by judiciary.
Right. Right. We leave it there. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking with us here on Times Now and sharing with us your perspective. Eventually, we'll see what really happens today. But thank you for the moment for joining us.